It wasn't only in the forums or in the colosseums that Rome displayed its grandeur. Behind the temples, military victories, and solemn speeches, there existed a much more intimate and private space where other battles were fought, those of desire, prestige, and power. Sexual parties in ancient Rome were not simply gatherings of debauchery, as is often portrayed in modern films or novels. In reality, they were carefully planned social rituals, true stages where political alliances were woven, wealth was displayed, and hierarchies reinforced. What is fascinating is that these erotic banquets did not exist outside Roman culture, they were deeply embedded within it. They were not the chaotic disorder of a decadent society but rather evidence of how Rome turned everything, even pleasure, into a language of dominance and discipline. The popular image of endless orgies and boundless depravity is merely a caricature. What actually occurred was far more complex, a private theater where one's own body, or that of others, became a political symbol. In these gatherings, sexuality was not mere entertainment but a means of communicating silent messages of power. Who dominates and who obeys? Who belongs to the elite and who is merely an instrument? Who is at the top and who will never be equal? Roman sexual parties reveal a society that, despite its apparent permissiveness, was governed by strict codes of masculinity, honor, and control. And it is precisely in that tension, between pleasure and politics, intimacy and ostentation, that we find the true meaning of these rituals. To understand how these sexual parties emerged within Roman culture, we must look back to the late Republic, when Lucius Cornelius Sulla, one of the most powerful and feared men of his time, marked a turning point in the private life of the elite. Sulla was not just a successful general or a dictator who ruled with an iron hand. He was also the first leader to institutionalize, within aristocratic circles, the so-called convivia libidinosa, banquets in which food and wine were only the prelude to a carefully designed erotic spectacle. Inspired by the customs of Hellenistic Greece, where private celebrations mixed philosophy, poetry, and eroticism, Sulla adapted them to Roman taste. But in his version, the goal was not contemplation or intellectual exchange but the display of power through pleasure. At these gatherings, often held in rural villas far from the city, the architecture itself served as a stage. Walled gardens, suggestive mosaics, frescoes with mythological sexual scenes, and lavishly decorated halls created an atmosphere that spoke both of refinement and of the host's dominance. Everything was arranged to impress: the music, sensual dances, courtesans trained not only in the art of the body but also in conversation and wit. Guests were carefully selected. Free men of high political and social status were the protagonists, accompanied by slaves, musicians, and hired performers. Elite women rarely participated, as public morality imposed on them the ideal of modesty and silence. In contrast, men of prestige could act with greater freedom, always under a fundamental rule: maintain the image of authority and dominance. Eroticism, in this context, was a silent language. Every gesture communicated hierarchies. The host affirmed his supremacy. Those who participated demonstrated loyalty or submission. Those who were the object of the spectacle were reduced to symbols, never equals. Thus, the convivia libidinosa were not simple private parties. They were political power rituals disguised as pleasure, social control mechanisms that reinforced the idea that in Rome even desire was subject to the discipline of order. And although other aristocrats later imitated this model, the shadow of Sulla remained as the starting point, the moment when the Roman elite transformed pleasure into a political tool. Roman elite sexual parties were not improvised gatherings or spontaneous outbursts of debauchery. They were strategically planned events, in which every detail was designed to stimulate the senses while projecting the host's grandeur and control. The location was key. Suburban and rural villas of the aristocracy were preferred settings, spaces removed from urban bustle that guaranteed privacy and exclusivity. Many of these residences had walled gardens, private pools, interconnected rooms, and fresco murals of strong erotic content. Cities such as Pompeii and Herculaneum have left us clear traces of this environment: explicit paintings of satyrs, nymphs, and gods in sexual acts decorating walls and ceilings like permanent reminders of pleasure. The layout of the space also had social significance. Guests usually reclined on triclinia, couches arranged in semicircles around the dining area. There, as food and wine were served, bodies relaxed and the atmosphere gradually charged with erotic tension. Eating, drinking, and observing were the prelude to the climax, sexual performances that could be private or public, depending on the purpose of the evening. Wine played a central role. Mixed with honey, spices, or natural aphrodisiacs like figs and oysters, it not only stimulated the senses but also created a controlled atmosphere of abandon. It was not about losing judgment, but about bringing attendees to a point of vulnerability where the host always retained authority. Music and dance were inseparable from the ritual. Slave musicians played the lyre, flute, or cymbals, while erotic dancers and mimes performed sensual or theatrical scenes. These performances could culminate in explicit acts, presented as part of the entertainment. Far from being considered vulgar, they were understood as symbols of refinement and mastery over the pleasures of the body. The use of phallic objects made of stone, wood, or leather, revealed through archaeology, was also part of these performances. They were used for stimulation as well as theatrical play, without the obscenity that such objects would carry centuries later. For the Roman elite, they were simply tools in the language of pleasure. But not everything was focused on carnal excess. Occasionally, the gatherings combined eroticism with intellectual debates, word games, or political discussions. Seduction could intertwine with oratory, and an erotic banquet could also become a stage for forging pacts and alliances. Each element had a function. The space ensured prestige. Wine and food stimulated surrender. Music and dance enveloped the senses. Eroticism, in its fullest expression, reinforced hierarchy. In short, these parties were not chaotic indulgences but meticulously choreographed rituals of power. Pleasure was not improvised, it was designed, controlled, and used as a social weapon. The sexual parties of the Roman elite cannot be understood without considering those who took part. While the host was always the center of authority, each attendee had a clearly defined role within the social choreography that brought these evenings to life. First, there were the main guests, senators, magistrates, generals, patrons, and men of prestige, all of high class and free. For them, attending a convivium libidinosum was not only a privilege but also a tacit obligation to reaffirm their position in the Roman hierarchy. Their presence was part of the spectacle, they represented the circle of power surrounding the host. But the true dynamism of these parties fell to the courtesans and slaves. Luxury courtesans, known as meretrices honesti, were not merely objects of physical pleasure. Many were educated in poetry, music, philosophy, or rhetoric, offering a broader experience. They could entertain with the mind as well as the body. In this sense, they were cultural mediators, capable of elevating an evening to the level of an almost intellectual ritual. Slaves, on the other hand, were destined for a far more subordinate role. Trained from a young age, their function was to satisfy desires and execute orders. Their presence constantly reminded all attendees of the host's absolute power over the lives and bodies of others. These gatherings also featured musicians and dancers, slaves trained from childhood in sensual arts. They played instruments, danced, or performed erotic scenes, often of a mythological nature. Although their work was essential for the atmosphere, socially they had no dignity, they were seen as extensions of the host's luxury. A particularly interesting role was that of the passive observer. These guests did not directly participate in sexual acts, but their presence had a political or symbolic purpose. Sometimes it was a strategic ally, invited to be seduced by the magnificence of the event. Other times, it was an adversary, brought to the party to be humiliated, forced to watch scenes that reduced them to a mere spectator. This simple gesture could send a clear message: you do not dominate here. Another fundamental aspect was the assignment of sexual roles. In Roman culture, a high-class man was always expected to occupy the active, dominant position. Even in the most lustful gatherings, this rule could not be broken without risking scandal. Being seen as passive, whether with women or men, meant losing status and public credibility. For this reason, Roman eroticism was not merely a matter of pleasure but a means of reinforcing invisible hierarchies in every act. Overall, participants created a mosaic of roles. The host projected authority and magnificence. The main guests reinforced their membership in the circle of power. The courtesans combined eroticism and intellect. The slaves materialized domination. Passive spectators embodied humiliation or political seduction. Thus, each party was more than a private gathering, it was a miniature representation of Roman society, with its hierarchies, tensions, and contradictions. The body, whether active, passive, or merely observed, was always charged with meaning. With the arrival of the empire, sexual parties ceased to be an exclusive privilege of certain aristocrats and became a stage where emperors projected their absolute power. What had once been a private, strategic ritual, in the hands of consuls or dictators, transformed into a spectacle of excess, often charged with theatricality and provocation. The legacy of erotic excess in imperial Rome. The first famous case is that of Tiberius, Augustus's successor. During his later years, the emperor retired to his villa on Capri, a place shrouded in mystery and rumor. According to the historian Suetonius, he organized erotic banquets there with young slaves and courtiers trained in sexual practices that were presented as part of a spectacle. The villa was adorned with statues, explicit frescoes, and erotic manuscripts that served as guides for these performances. Even sexual water games are mentioned in the emperor's private pools. While some details are exaggerated by hostile sources, Capri's reputation as a refuge of imperial excess persisted for centuries, becoming synonymous with isolation, pleasure, and decadence. Next came Caligula, Tiberius's great-nephew, whose private life intertwined with his turbulent rule. He ascended to power at just 25 years old, and his reign quickly became described as a whirlwind of theater, eroticism, and political provocation. Chroniclers such as Suetonius and Cassius Dio depict him hosting banquets where he forced senators' wives to participate or holding sexual contests among courtesans before the elite. He was also attributed with fictitious marriages and incestuous relations, though it is difficult to separate reality from hostile propaganda. What is clear is that Caligula used sexuality as a tool of humiliation and control, demonstrating that his authority knew no limits, neither in public nor in private. But it was under Nero that sexual festivities reached their most theatrical and scandalous point. Nero, a lover of the performing arts, turned his celebrations into dramatic enactments of desire. He organized erotic processions along the Tiber River on rafts decorated as floating brothels and held simulated marriages with both women and men, complete with witnesses, banquets, and rituals. His masterpiece of excess was the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a monumental palace designed for luxury, where ceilings showered perfumes and rose petals upon guests, and rooms served both for feasting and pleasure. There, eroticism was part of a carefully written script by the emperor himself. What united Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero was not only debauchery but the use of eroticism as a symbol of absolute power. Sexual parties were no longer mere aristocratic prestige rituals, they were imperial manifestos, demonstrations that the emperor controlled not only laws and armies but also the bodies, norms, and pleasures of Rome. In their hands, eroticism ceased to be private and became a form of governance. It was politics, theater, and provocation, all at once. Although Rome is often portrayed as a civilization of unchecked permissiveness, the reality was much more contradictory. The same populace that delighted in bloody spectacles at the Colosseum or in tales of imperial excess lived public lives governed by rigid norms of morality and discipline. Sexual festivities, however lavish, did not escape these social structures. Even in the most private contexts, rules of honor and hierarchy defined the limits of what was permissible. For a free Roman citizen, especially of the upper class, there was an unbreakable expectation: he must always be the dominant, the active, the one in control. Being seen in a passive position, whether with women or men, was considered a form of humiliation that called into question his virility and, by extension, his social authority. Women from respectable families rarely participated in these celebrations. Roman society demanded modesty, chastity, and discretion from them, restricting their role to the domestic and reproductive spheres. Their presence at erotic banquets was almost always forbidden, except in exceptional and heavily criticized cases. Instead, the central role was occupied by courtesans, slaves, or erotic performers, women without full rights, yet indispensable in these settings. Some high-class courtesans, called meritresses honesti, gained certain prestige, offering not only physical pleasure but also refined conversation, poetry, or music. However, they were never considered equal in dignity to aristocratic ladies. This contrast reveals one of Rome's greatest paradoxes. In private, the powerful could indulge in erotic excess, but in public, they had to project discipline, moderation, and honor. The double standard was so common that it became part of the social fabric. A senator could host a banquet filled with sensuality and, the next day, defend laws in the Senate that punished adultery or promoted family purity. The state itself intervened to reinforce this image of morality. During Augustus's reign, laws such as the Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coercendis were enacted, criminalizing female adultery and seeking to protect the institution of marriage. These laws, however, had an obvious bias. Men could use prostitutes without being considered adulterers, provided they did not engage with married women of good reputation. Thus, prostitution, though publicly despised, became a functional piece of Roman sexual order, allowing men to satisfy their desires without threatening the family structure. Sexual parties, then, were both a refuge of permissiveness and a reminder of hierarchy. They did not represent unregulated libertinism but a space where rules were bent, not abolished. Male dominance remained central, free women stayed apart, and slaves or courtesans were tools, not equals. Rome offers a fascinating lesson here. Its society was not divided between morality and debauchery but combined both aspects in a delicate balance. What occurred behind marble curtains must never break the facade of discipline that upheld the empire. Looking back, the sexual parties of ancient Rome reveal much more than episodes of lust and excess. They were, in reality, a window into the intimate workings of a complex society, where pleasure was interwoven with politics, power, and social hierarchy. For the Romans, sex was not merely a matter of personal desire. It was a social language loaded with symbols, a tool for negotiation, and a way to assert dominance. In the convivia libidinosa organized by men like Sulla, in Tiberius' villas in Capri, or in Nero's theatrical banquets, eroticism functioned as a mirror of authority. Whoever controlled bodies also controlled the power dynamics. These celebrations, which at first glance may seem like mere private indulgences, actually had a broader political and cultural function. They served to consolidate alliances among aristocrats, humiliate adversaries by exposing them in uncomfortable situations, project the host's splendor and generosity, capable of offering such an exclusive spectacle, reinforce social hierarchies even in the most intimate settings. Free men dominated, courtesans served, and respectable women remained on the sidelines. What is fascinating is how Rome managed to maintain this paradox. While publicly upholding values of discipline, modesty, and family, privately they cultivated spaces where permissiveness and excess were allowed, though always under implicit rules. This double standard was not a contradiction for the Romans, but a necessary balance to maintain the cohesion of their system. Over time, and especially after the arrival of Christianity, these practices began to be seen as decadent, symbols of moral corruption and social disorder. The same emperors who had previously used sexuality as a spectacle of power were later condemned in Christian chronicles as examples of tyranny and degeneration. What had been an instrument of dominance in life became a historical warning of what it means to succumb to excess. Beyond later censorship, these parties left a cultural legacy that still sparks debate today. On one hand, they remind us of the universal humanity of desire, always present even in the most disciplined civilizations. On the other, they show how pleasure itself can be used as a political weapon, a tool of control, or a stage for power. Ultimately, Roman sexual festivities speak to the eternal duality of the human condition, between desire and discipline, private and public, the pursuit of pleasure and the need for order. Rome lived within this contradiction, and perhaps that is why it continues to fascinate us. Today, when walking through the ruins of the Colosseum, the Domus Aurea, or the villas of Capri, we do not only see stone and mosaics. We hear the echoes of those nights where music, wine, and eroticism intertwined with intrigue, alliances, and rivalries. We see how the body became a stage of power, and how even pleasure was regulated by the weight of Roman hierarchy. This is the true legacy of Rome's sexual feasts, to remind us that history is measured not only in battles, laws, or conquests, but also in the most intimate spaces where humans reveal who they truly are. Understanding these excesses is not about voyeurism, but about memory, recognizing that the greatness of a civilization also includes its shadows, its excesses, and its contradictions.